Greetings. It's been a few months since my last episode, but t- today I'll be recording episode 22 of Canadian Meets the South. I'll be reviewing a book by Lynne Cheney called The Virginia Dynasty: Four Presidents and the Creation of the American Nation. And of course, those four presidents would be George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, and James Monroe. Now, the first thing I thought of when I read the title of the Virginia Dynasty was that Kevin Goodsman, who's I think he's a professor from Connecticut, also had a book that he came out with like last year called The Jeffersonians. But that book was focused just on Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Well, as in those didn't focus too much on Washington. I guess he was also thinking of the Virginia Dynasty, having a title like that, but Lynne Cheney came out with this book in 2020. So, well, of course, it does talk about what the four presidents did during the Adams administration, which was just 4 years. But it starts with how they with their relationships. I got the sense from this book that was all going to be all about the relationships between the four men. So at the beginning, during the American War for Independence, George Washington and James Monroe were soldiers. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson and James Madison were politicians. For some of the time periods, I'm not going to remember all of the years, but Thomas Jefferson was governor of Virginia. But yeah, it went in at the beginning, like in the American War for Independence. It dived somewhat deep into George Washington and James Monroe's relationship, as James Monroe was, was Washington's subordinate, and he didn't always agree with him. And Monroe wasn't a soldier for the entirety of the war. When he was young, in 1776, I think he was 18. And he stopped school to go fight the war. Oh man, my memory is kind of fuzzy. Meanwhile, George Washington was already an accomplished soldier from the French and Indian Wars. But afterwards, so that would be one part. And I think Monroe did have some disagreements with Washington, although sorry, my memory, like I said, is kind of hazy. And you also have Thomas Jefferson and James Madison, and they did have a relationship. I think Madison was in the House of Delegates for some of them. For some of the time during the war, and then both Madison and Monroe would serve as like delegates in the, well, I don't know if that's the right term, in the Confederation Congress. And it went into how they were sort of rivals for first the first election to the first Congress, to the first House of Representatives, and then which mm, Madison defeated Monroe, but and then also later for in 1808 for the presidency, but they were also friends, and then I guess Monroe didn't like how it seemed that Jefferson was really backing Madison for to be his successor in 1808. But they were both friends with Jefferson. On the other hand, all three of them were they started off with on good terms with Washington, you could say. Well, after the war, a few years after the war, you would have the Constitutional Convention. Well, I'm sorry. I mean the Philadelphia Convention in 1787, and found it interesting, like what each of their positions were. The four men. So Washington and Madison supported the Constitution, and they were actually there at the Philadelphia Convention. Now Jefferson was in France, and it's not that he was against the Constitution, but his support for it was not as big, and then I think he was hoping that like maybe only 9 out of the 13 would ratify, not all of them, so that, but because he saw that there were some things that could be improved. And then Monroe was, during the ratification, during Virginia's ratifying convention, Monroe was against the ratification of the Constitution. Well, of course, Madison was in favor of it, and Patrick Henry was against it, and because he believed it would centralize too much power and was too undemocratic. And yeah, Patrick Henry would, I think, through like political maneuvering, stop Madison's from being elected to the U.S. Senate, but he didn't want Madison to be successful in successfully elected to the House of Representatives. But Madison did beat Monroe, and they were still, friends after that election. So I guess one big thing that I learned is that at the epilogue, he said Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, they were kind of struggling with finances. Well, they had a lot of land, and sometimes they would sell land to pay their debts. And they all, like I said before, had at first a decent relationship with George Washington, but then towards the end of Washington's lifetime, it was really bad. So Jefferson initially served in the cabinet as Secretary of State. Well, before he left in 1791, and Madison was in the House of Representatives, and also pushing and you could say sometimes criticizing George Washington for some unconstitutional things, including the Declaration of Neutrality, which he believed was that Washington did what he declared neutrality when because they were in Britain and France were having really high tensions, and then Monroe was minister to France from 1794 to 1796. I think, yeah, it wasn't just him. I think Jefferson had also spent time in France. He was the minister of France during the Articles of Confederation when the Constitution was being ratified. So they both spoke French. I'm not 100% sure, but I think Madison also spoke French. I think John Quincy Adams spoke French too. I think, but and there were talks of the the revolution took place during the French Revolution from 1789 to 1799, and there was like the various American responses to it, and including how Monroe was in France during a part of that, but he was recalled by George Washington. Like George Washington, he served under George Washington from 1794 to 1796, and then was recalled because and then that was like the straw that broke Monroe. I apologize, I can't remember exactly why, but that's like their final break. Washington and Monroe, and I mean Jefferson had resigned years before, 1791. No, I think, and then and also talked about Hamilton's influence. Sorry, and during the Washington wasn't really a Federalist, but he came closer to like Federalist policies. He listened to Alexander Hamilton a lot, and so that's why sometimes I guess he's not counted as part of the Virginia Dynasty. Not to mention that there's like a 4-year gap between Washington and the other presidents. Like if you're putting them into a block, and then of course you have the 4-year John Adams presidency, and the Sedition and Alien and Sedition Acts. And what I liked about this book was that it covered the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions or resolves of 1798, and also the 1799 Kentucky resolutions. And because I remember Tom Woods talking in his book Nullification, talked about how all these Jefferson scholars wouldn't mention this. Wouldn't mention 1798, like the Kentucky resolves. Like a lot of historians in general wouldn't talk about the Virginia and Kentucky resolves. But I appreciate that it was mentioned in this book, and how Washington backed these, backed the Alien Sedition Acts, and he thought that these were necessary, especially when it came time to war. While Jefferson and Madison believed these were unconstitutional. And so you would see a split in, I guess, visions for America, because Washington was definitely the most nationalist out of these four presidents. That's not to say that Madison wasn't a nationalist, because he was during the convention, and he didn't believe, well, like Hamilton, he didn't believe that the Constitution would centralize enough power. It wasn't. It didn't, and like the Constitution did not end up being drafted the way the nationalist way he wanted, and not mentioned in this book, but he wanted like what we would call today an incorporation amendment, that when drafting the Bill of Rights, because he so he was in the first Congress working on the Bill of Rights. What would happen was all the states would like submit their proposals for amendments to be in the Bill of Rights, and Madison wanted the Bill of Rights to restrict the states. That's just why I said incorporation, but it was resoundingly rejected by the first Congress. So like that shows you like Madison was also, nationalistic, but not to mention the you could say less nationalistic as a president compared to Washington. Well, because he was against the first bank when Washington was president, but then he signs the second Bank of the United States, and that is a problem. And he, on his Madison's last day, in office, he vetoes John C. Calhoun's bonus bill, which, it wasn't really called John C. Calhoun's bonus bill in the book, but that it was. It was like an anti-nationalist veto, and in accordance with the Constitution. And well, Madison did think of it not necessarily as a bad idea, but like I said, the Constitution. What else can I say? Certainly talking about the election of 1796 and 1800, how the 12th Amendment was not yet in existence, so the vice, like everyone, like the president would have the most votes and the vice president would have the second most votes. That's how Jefferson became Adams's vice president, and then sorry, I just finished the end of the book, but it took me a lot, maybe longer, and it was drawn out. So now, like, especially towards the beginning, my memory is fuzzy. So, of course, one last thing. Towards the end of Madison's presidency, many people were tired of Virginia, and I found it interesting. One guy had said that James I would crown James II, referring to James I being Madison and James II being Monroe. And also, talked about, because I think in the context of this was the that brief moment in time in which Monroe was both the Secretary of State and the Secretary of War during the War of 1812. And I found it interesting that how he initially was against conscription, but then 1 year later he was in favor of it. And he was being political because he was saying this, like when he was against conscription, it was another guy who was the Secretary of War, and he wanted, and that guy was in favor of conscription at that time. So it was certainly political, and I like how, in 1808, the old Republicans had backed Monroe, like guys like John Randolph of Roanoke, I think John Taylor of Caroline backed Monroe over Madison, and like you can see, because they saw like Madison was more centralist, even though they were not happy that Monroe also was in favor of conscription, which actually didn't occur in the end. And near the end of the book, like it would be it went into how they like the transition from the era of good feelings to John Quincy Adams becoming the president. So, okay, final thoughts on this book. I think it's good. It was a good book. Like when I saw the full title, like Four Presidents and the Creation of the American Nation, so I was like, okay, is this author Lynne Cheney? So like on the, I guess, more nationalistic side, maybe, but because she probably knows that the word nation was struck out of the Constitution at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787 because the delegates, well, this was on the motion of Oliver Ellsworth. The delegates knew that the word nation was not befitting of the general government that they were going to create. What else? Okay, let's talk about contemporary news, shall we? So I think like last week, there was a failed assassination attempt on Donald Trump, and supposedly he survived because he tilted his head in a certain way so that the bullet would only go through his ear and not through his cranium. And then yesterday, well, I mean, when this comes out, this will be like 2 days from now. Joe Biden dropped out of the presidential race and endorsed Kamala Harris. So, what can I say? This is, let's see, I'm not sure who's gonna win now because, well, people knew that like Joe Biden was kind of like being a puppet essentially. He was really old, and then his cognizance isn't always there. So he's just gonna. But he wants to put president on the title president on his tombstone. So I mean he got that, but well, let's see. Many people are supporting Kamala Harris, like the Clintons are. I think AOC is. But yeah. Well, we'll see. Um, now, how can I bring Canada into this conversation? We don't have an election until next year at most. Like I think like October, because it was October in 2021, the last federal election. So now it's like October. So it should be like October 2025. And yeah, people. I'm seeing at least the. I'm getting the vibes that people are tired of Trudeau now. Because in 2015 he at least a lot of people were enthusiastic about him because he said, no, not just for marijuana, but that he said it would be the last election of first past the post. Well, yeah, so they wanted election reform. Well, that didn't happen. So, there was also the UK elections, and like if you guys, any Americans don't know this, like several Commonwealth countries, including Canada, that's are have like the citizens of certain countries like Canada have the right to vote in the UK election. And also, weirdly enough, Republic of Ireland, even though their country is technically not loyal to the king. But yeah, Rishi Sunak lost, and like the conservative prime minister, and he now it's Labour, Keir Starmer. And what people, I guess people notice is that that Labour got more seats, not a majority, but they got less overall votes than uh, Labour in 2019 when Jeremy Corbyn was the leader. And funny thing is, Jeremy Corbyn is now an independent member of Parliament because Keir Starmer didn't let him run under Labour. And Keir Starmer is supposed to be a more moderate guy, but still a progressive, like more moderate compared to Jeremy Corbyn. And then we'll see. We'll see. Like, I think Jacob Rees-Mogg, who I really like, lost his seat, but then he said like, if you compare if you compare Tony Blair to Keir Starmer, people were expecting a lot from Tony Blair, while as people aren't expecting a lot from Keir Starmer, and he and then I guess another thing to note is that the Reform Party in the UK, led by Nigel Farage, was got 5 seats, including Nigel's, and what I found interesting, I was just listening to one of his press conferences, and he said he takes inspiration from Preston Manning's Reform Party many decades ago, like before I was born, and how the Reform Party changed the landscape of Canada, of the political landscape of Canada permanently. So, brief explanation. Reform Party was led by Preston Manning, who was the son of the social credit premier of Alberta, Ernest Manning. Well, Preston Manning was like a candidate in the 1965 Canadian federal election, but he lost. And in 1988, I think was their first election, but they didn't have a full slate. I don't think Reform ever had a full slate, and they all the Reform candidates lost, including not just Preston Manning, but also future Prime Minister Stephen Harper. And in '89, Deborah Gray wins a by-election, so she becomes the first Reform MP. And then in '93, they don't become the official opposition. It's actually the Bloc Québécois, but the reigning Conservatives, who were led by Kim Campbell for just a few months, and right before that was Brian Mulroney for 9 years, 1984 to 1993. They fell apart, and Reform became the dominant right-wing party, at least in the West. And I guess he, in '93, and then remember, '94 was in the U.S. the Republican Revolution, because in the House of Representatives, the had been Democrat controlled for 40 years. So I think political commentators at the time were comparing Manning and the guy who became Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. And they were at those times they were the face of conservatism, although Manning was never was always in opposition. 1997, you have the election. You have the election in which where Reform finally becomes official opposition, and then in 2000 they decide to create a new party called Canadian Alliance, and because they're interested in merging in what's called Unite the Right. They want to unify the party, which was, I think, they wanted to, the Eastern Progressive Conservatives. It's weird to call them Eastern, but with their party, like Canadian Reform Alliance, and then they merged in 2004. Well, in 2000, Preston was removed as leader. Was defeated at the leadership election, and then Stockwell Day became leader. But then 2002. But then after the election, Stockwell Day lost. So then 2002, Harper defeated him in an election, and then he was the leader of the Canadian Alliance, while as I'm blanking out on his name, but Peter MacKay became who was the final leader of the Progressive Conservatives, became leader decided to merge parties, and there you have the modern Conservative Party. So sorry that could have been a smoother explanation, but that's what Nigel Farage is taking from. No, that's the Reform. This is how Reform in Canada took transformed the Canadian political landscape, and that's whom, and Preston Manning is from whom Nigel Farage takes inspiration from. But yeah, I might come up with another podcast but before the November election in the U.S. We'll see. It depends on how fast I go through another book. I'll have to decide which book I will choose, and it might not necessarily be like another Southern book. It might, but it's now I'm after like the Anabaptists. Well, and before the Anabaptist stories, and before that, the Pope Who Would Be King, which was about Pius IX. Now I really wanna like talk more about like books on related to Catholicism or in Christianity. But yes, thank you for watching my podcast or listening to my podcast. And if you found it interesting, if you find this podcast interesting, please look forward to the next one. And if you like watch any of my previous podcasts, and I always title them by the name of the book I'm reviewing. But thank you. Bye.